right, I think we can get started here. Hello, and welcome to Iowa Ideas In-Depth Week. This is the Gazette's 9th year of Iowa Ideas, an initiative that explores topics that are important to Iowans. This week, we're focusing on extreme weather in Iowa. I'm your moderator today, Sara Baranowski, managing editor at the Gazette. I'd like to recognize Iowa Ideas presenting sponsor, ITC Midwest, and thank them for making this session and all of Iowa Ideas possible. During our time together today, we'll talk with our panelists and address audience questions. If you have a question at any point during this session, you can type it into the Q&A box or in the Zoom chat box, and our tech host will forward it to me to be included in the conversation. I'll try to pepper those in throughout our discussion, but I might also leave some time at the end for questions. Today, we'll be discussing designing for the future of extreme weather, what's going into the design and construction of infrastructure and housing in Iowa as a result of the lessons learned from previous natural disasters. To explore this topic, I'm joined by 4 panelists today. They're Tamara Brunow, president of Brunow Contracting, Olivia Calvin, systems impact planner at the Iowa Department of Transportation, Rob Davis, flood control systems program manager at the city of Cedar Rapids, and Deron Muehring, water and resource recovery center director at the city of Dubuque. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us. All right, I'd like to set the stage here before we get too far into the discussion, or before we get into it at all, and ask each panelist to share with us how in their work they designed for the future of extreme weather. It looks different for every one of you. Each of you has a different perspective and different experience in this area. We'll start with Tamara and then move to Olivia, Rob, and Deron. So if you've worked on a specific project or you're part of a larger organization that tackles these challenges, feel free to share that with us. So Tamara, let's start with you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me, Sara. My name is Tamara Brunow. I am the president of Brunow Contracting. My background is in disaster recovery, contracting, and heavy infrastructure. Federal clients of mine range from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to the U.S. Forest Service, state municipality agencies. Usually I'm working with the state emergency management agencies, and even at times local municipal agencies. Disaster recovery is an integral part of my business, and we are excited to have this opportunity today to speak about resiliency and the extreme weather that we seem to be increasing in the state of Iowa. Thanks, Sara.
Yeah. Olivia, how about you?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. Like Sara said, my name is Olivia Calvin. I'm the Systems Impact Planner at the Iowa Department of Transportation. I actually just started in this role in January. Previously, I worked in environmental consulting, but in the role that I'm currently in with the DOT, my role is primarily integrating the resiliency and the resilience projects that are happening all across the state into our long-range planning. And then I also, in terms of natural hazards and designing for those, I do a lot of system-wide screening and analyses to see what areas of our transportation system could be particularly vulnerable to different natural hazards and weather events.
All right. Rob, you're next.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rob Davis. With the city of Cedar Rapids. I've been with the city since 1998, and I started my career here after being in the private sector. Had 10 years doing standard municipal engineering type projects, and then we had a near 1,000-year flood in 2008. And I still have my normal day job, but for the next 5 years, we worked on flood recovery, and there was a lot to take care of when you own 300 buildings that got impacted. There was $5.4 billion worth of damage in Cedar Rapids alone. And that's since, say we pretty well were done with that about 2014, and that included over 1,380 buyouts as well. So a lot of flood recovery. And then in 2014, we switched focus, and really I had to give up that day job because it became a full-time endeavor to build flood control system along the Cedar River. That's currently estimated about $1.25 billion project. which I am the day-to-day operations manager of, and we're probably about 10 years into a 25-year project right now to protect the core of the city of Cedar Rapids, which of course is an economic driver for the region. So as Cedar Rapids goes, that can also affect the economy of other communities as well. Thank you.
All right, Deron, you're up.
Good afternoon, everybody. Again, Deron Muehring, Water Resource Recovery Center Director for the City of Dubuque. I've been with the city for about 27 years, and the bulk of that was as a kind of a civil engineer or civil engineer by title. I was really the city's stormwater engineer as hired way back in like 1998. And, the primary role there is addressing flooding issues on small scales. So that could just be meeting with a single resident that has a problem at their individual property. But then also just big, large scale projects or issues that impact, hundreds of people, neighborhoods, really projects that require a solution that's too big. Sometimes there are citizens in our cities that there's nothing they can do individually to protect themselves or address a flooding problem. They're really at the mercy of the city to try and address it, or it just gets left undressed. So one of the things that we've been working on for the past really 20 plus years is the development, planning, implementation of the B Branch Creek Watershed Management Project, about a $230 million multi-phase project that's going to take us, literally 2+ decades to build. But we've been, two plus because we've already been at it for 2 decades. So, but we've been working towards implementing the various phases, and we're getting close to the last piece of the puzzle. Big improvement project is under construction right now. So, but it's been a long journey for us as a community to take on such a big project.
All right, and I'll have more questions about that project later. Rob, I wanted to start with you. Could you talk a little bit about how the city of Cedar Rapids progressed from the 2008 flood, which was just so devastating for the entire city? How did you respond to the flood? I mean, there was the cleanup after the fact, and then how did that become this I think you said it's $1.25 billion project to protect the city from the future flood of that magnitude? Like, how do you create a plan that big, I guess?
Well, it's very interesting that you asked that question, Sarah. Our city council, and I can't thank the city councils in past and current for their unwavering commitment to this. The vision that they had, we had a preliminary plan put together in just 5 months after the flood of 2008. City council adopted a preliminary plan with an alignment that was not done in a vacuum. There were so many public meetings at all the schools, and we were so many places collecting data from the people and what they thought was important, and really what came out of that was to protect as many properties as we possibly could. And then it morphed a little bit into, as we were recovering, as I said, one of my jobs was to recover. The council had a vision. We kept saying, well, look at this. Should we really be putting this building back the way it was? This was a golf course clubhouse, and it had, just concrete in the restrooms. That's not commensurate with what you'd expect. But maybe at a swimming pool, bathroom, but not at a clubhouse. And so we started talking from that do we really want to put things back the way we found them? And city council gave staff I think it was a resolution of 15% we could spend extra on putting the items back better than we found them without having to go for specific approval from them. And then, that kind of led to what our mayor says today, how we're hiding the system in plain sight. What we've found is the flood control system really needs to blend into the background. The first thing we built was the amphitheater levee. Well, you go there and you see a show. You're not thinking about it being flood control. So it's really evolved into what the community needs on a daily basis. not the once in a blue moon when it floods. So in order for that to really be a vibrant community, you cannot lose sight of how you could use it when it's not flooding. And so that was probably not something we thought about when we started, but have really come to embrace through multiple city councils, through our city manager. And, like we were mentioning the B branch, that is a big improvement in Dubuque of what it used to look like. It's much more natural. I think we're seeing, yes, flood control is there, but people don't ask us if the flood control system is going to work. They ask us about the trails or the amphitheater, and oh my gosh, there's restrooms at the amphitheater now, and that's actually a flood wall with a building attached to it. You don't see it. Our busiest park right now seems to be one we built with the flood control system, as we had to relocate some features. So that's what I think how it's morphed, and it's been an interesting transformation.
All right. Could you give an example, like the 15% more? You kind of alluded to a restroom issue, or maybe that's the amphitheater, spending a little bit more to make something better than it was before.
So I'll give you a good example. We're building 13 to 16 foot high walls along the Cedar River. You can get a sense of being walled in, right? And be afraid of the river. How do you maybe make that more inviting? So we've actually added some archways and entranceways over the top of those that says gateway to Czech Village or gateway to New Bohemia, and try to invite you into that area. Now, from a standpoint of some optics, we said to ourselves, we don't just want the gateway there. We don't want them to notice the flood walls because it does feel a little imposing. So why not draw their attention to something that looks straight ahead, not at the flood wall gates to the left and right, and let's put something a little taller than the flood walls. So some of these things are done for recreational purposes or optics purposes. I mentioned the amphitheater. We used to have porta johns out there for shows of 2,500 people. That's not really something you want when you spend $75 for a ticket, right? So we knew we had to build a flood wall through there, and people don't want to see a flood wall at the amphitheater. So we built the flood wall as one of the four walls of a restroom building. So you're now seeing that as an amenity you use on every show. So that's how I'm kind of talking about things blending in the background. Yes, you can see the flood control there, but you don't necessarily see it as the primary element because it's primarily not flooding. Did that answer your question?
It does, yeah. And actually, I had another, one of my follow-up questions was going to be what is the purpose of the system? And it really feels like it's multifaceted. Like you said, yes, the purpose is to protect the city from floods, but it's also to serve as restroom or as a park or an amphitheater. There are multiple purposes. It's not just one thing that you're building for.
Absolutely. Who would have thought as an engineer we'd be consulting with wedding planners so that you could make sure you design the site that could accommodate outdoor receptions for your flood system.
But in that case, though, then you can get some revenue maybe through renting it out for weddings, whereas normally nobody's going to want to rent it for a flood wall area for a wedding.
So, and if we go back into the 1960s, the Army Corps of Engineers offered the city of Cedar Rapids some flood control along the Cedar River. And I'll say it would not have worked because it would have been way too short. Probably 8 or 10 feet shorter than we actually would have needed in 2008. But the city had good vision back then. We actually turned it down because all they were going to build was walls throughout the city and wall the city from the river and create fear. We're not creating fear right now. We're actually creating opportunity and excitement, and people are rebuilding and investing before we're even done with the flood control system because they see the promise of that comprehensive view.
And then my other question was, I think you said this in your introduction, where does the project stand now? You went full time with the project in 2014, I think. But now we're 11 years past that. I think did you say it's a 25-year project?
It'll probably take about 25 years, and we'll be at that point, 95% complete or so. And then that's essentially complete because we can use temporary pumps instead of permanent pumps at that point. Where we stand today, we're between 35% and 40% complete with the full system. But it's actually much more effective than that for getting the economic development parts that I mentioned. Going to strict public works types things, we built in the lowest areas first, and we protected some of the harder hit areas first. So if we just go back a decade ago, we had our second highest flood record in 2016. We have to do less than half of the protection that we did back then. Even though we've only built, slightly over a third, we produce more than half the things we have to do because of how we've built it and where we've built it. So you could say we're, anywhere between 35 maybe and 50% done because of how much we built and how much we produced with a temporary protection.
Okay. All right, Deron, I want to bring you in because we're talking about flooding, and we've alluded to the B branch project. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about it. What is it? Why did it become necessary? How does it work? I will say the city of Dubuque has a really great video on their website that explains the B branch project. I should add the link here, but I wonder if you could talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, we're looking at it from a watershed scale. So like as engineers, first we look at it, I say we work on it for 20 years. The first thing is trying to understand the nature of the problem. So how much is actually running off the landscape? How much do we actually have to deal with and manage safely through our community? And then from that, we then look at ways to mitigate that. So there are three ways the B branch project mitigates flooding. One is it tries to reduce the volume of water that actually runs off the surface, and we do that through pervious pavement systems, or green alleys, we call them. So there's about 240 alleys in the B branch watershed, and our, like I said, multi-decade project is to convert those to green alleys. We've done about 70 to date, 70 plus to date. And then the second way to mitigate the flooding, because really, to step back, the problem is you have too much water all getting in the same place at the same time. And so if you reduce the volume, obviously you're going to reduce what actually ultimately ends up at the flood prone area. And then we also have upstream detention basins that basically hold back the water to prevent it from, allow the downstream area to drain before it, the bulk of that water comes down, kind of slowly release it. So we kind of those are the first two things we try to determine and find. Those can be limited as far as their effectiveness, where they are in the watershed. Then the last main feature of the multi-phase project is what we call the B branch creek, or the daylighting of a creek. We had a 100-plus-year-old buried storm sewer, because that's what people did way back, turn of the 20th century, was to bury these creeks in storm sewers and then kind of forget about them. And then over time, when these rainstorms happen, then all of a sudden, oh, that's right, there's stormwater that has to move through this area. And so our project was to daylight that, basically remove the storm sewer, recreate a creek, which was about a 15 to 20 foot wide area, where most of the water, routine days, sunny days, where the water kind of meanders through. But then also recreates a kind of a pseudo floodplain. So when we have these big rainstorms, the water can then spill out of the banks of that creek, fill up a green space, and then, slowly make its way through our community without flooding streets, without flooding basements and homes and stranding, people in their cars. And so the B branch creek is probably the most widely, it's the key, the cornerstone, the foundation of the project, because without it, that's where all the stormwater has to go. And again, we made this green space out of it, and even that part of the creek daylighting has been multi-phase, because we had to, usually you want to work downstream to upstream, but in this case we had to cross through a working railroad, and so we had to negotiate with a railroad and deal with them as far as putting a storm sewer conveyance through their property. And so it's been a long time. So the first phase of the project was done in 2011. When I say the project, I'm talking about the creek project. 2011 was the downstream section that empties into the Mississippi River. And then we had to leapfrog over the railroad section and do the upper section. That was completed in 2017. And then we were able to complete the railroad crossing portion, connect the two basically, in about 2019 is when we finished that project, 2020. And then we're still working on another phase I mentioned is right at the Mississippi River. We have a flood wall levee system built by the Corps of Engineers back in about 1970. I mean, it took about 6 years to build, but and what we're doing there is reconstructing the pumping station that serves the community. So when the Mississippi River gets high, we have to close the floodgates, prevent the Mississippi River from backing up and flooding the community, like it had many times prior to 1970. But then when that happens, anytime it rains in Dubuque, then all that water has to be pumped into the Mississippi River from the community. And so we're replacing that pump station, upgrading that pump station.
And that's the major project that you were referencing earlier.
Yeah, that's the last kind of the very downstream. So the entire B branch project is about 240 million, give or take. It's still a lot of its estimates because we're still working on it, and that's about a $30 million undertaking. This last section of this large pump station to pump the water out. So this would be right downstream of the creek restoration project at the Mississippi River. Yeah.
And I think similar to Cedar Rapids, there are trails now along the creek, and like it's a place for recreation.
Yeah, similar to what Rob was talking about. As a community, if you think about it, the reason people move to Cedar Rapids and move to Dubuque is probably because of the rivers, right? And being Mississippi and Cedar Rapids has the rivers there that people are drawn to water. It's they use the water for industry and things like that. And so, like Rob was saying, is if you create these walls and barriers, you're kind of getting away from what made you in a way. And so one of the things we have to do is be mindful of as engineers or city planners or city representatives is that we're trying to create a place that's livable for the community. So we can't try to solve a flooding problem and then by doing so make it so nobody wants to live there. That's kind of be a waste of money. So some of these things might sound like we're adding these amenities or things that, well, do you really need that? Do you really need an amphitheater? Do you need a bike trail? I guess the short answer is you have to make a community livable. And if those are the things that help make it livable and make the project succeed, then you have to do those things. They're not options. And so like our Mississippi River flood wall system, we have buried certain sections of the flood wall. So ours was a combination of levee systems, which is really a trapezoidal, berm embankment. But then you have somewhere just the eye wall. So it's just a concrete, pillar, and like the barrier that Rob was talking about. So in some instances, we've actually buried those walls inside of a levee system, and then we have the trail that goes along the top. So again, people still can gain access to the river along this trail, like you mentioned, that goes along top of that levee system.
I wondered. So you started the construction in 2011. Have you had a chance to test it? Have you had instances where previously it would have flooded and people would have been, like you said, in cars on flooded streets?
Yeah, we haven't been severely tested. In 2011, I think we got like 11 inches in 6 hours, 11 inches of rain in 6 hours. So we haven't anything like that for a while, but there was a similar instance where we were able to compare a couple of rainstorms. It was like, I want to say it was like 2.5 inches in 3 hours or something like that. And there were kind of very similar instances. We were able to actually look at traffic cameras that we have to look at how the flooding impacted in the one. So back prior to the project, before we were done with the upper B branch, so maybe 2013 or 14, we can see that the flooding that ensued in these streets. And then we had another similar one in like 2020, where if you look at the street, the same traffic camera, there is no flooding. I mean, the traffic is normal. The previous storm, people had to avoid, gushing water coming out of the storm sewer systems. And so, yeah, it's definitely made an impact. And it's one of those things too, that I don't know. I don't know if people watch football or not, but it's kind of like the offensive line of what we do. You only recognize the offensive line when they get called for a penalty, when they fail, when they or they give up a sack, when we don't get recognized when things go well. So as a civil engineer or a city designer for these flood control systems, it's hard to say, well, I don't know, probably would have flooded it, 10 years ago, but we didn't today, and that's what really matters.
No one calls you and says, I noticed it didn't flood.
That's right.
Well, and I was going to ask Rob about that. You said that, people say, oh, we love the trail, we love the amphitheater, but they don't say, like, I love all the flood protection you've put in. But you alluded to the 2016 flood. Have there been other instances where you've had to test portions of the flood control system where it's been successful?
Well, I would agree with the previous comments that you only get commented on when things don't work well. And we've closed a lot of streets while we're building the system. We've tested it as we're making sure it operates well. But we really haven't had a lot of testing because we're flooding. We've had a lot of high water this year, but not to the levels that we would really be needing to use this system in most of the cases. We use a few pieces of it here or there, but we haven't had to use it for the majority of the time. Again, people do notice it because we're going to test those gates at least once a year, and we will keep closing roads as we're trying to build gates across roads. We're making every effort not to close too many roads at once. But I mean, that because that's pretty well close to downtown. You probably had to dodge a lot of construction zones, and sometimes this flood control work is a few blocks from the river. So yes, we're probably getting called for a lot of penalties on the offensive line related to the traffic not flowing through easy enough. But that's really what people are seeing. They're not seeing the use of it to fight floods at the moment. Thank goodness.
Yeah. Tamara, I want to bring you into the discussion, and you mentioned in your introduction that you have a background of working with the Army Corps. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the disaster recovery projects you've been a part of, so we understand kind of what space you're working in and what that looks like for you.
Sure. So yes, I do work with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Projects that I've worked on for them, I would say that my projects come in stages, meaning that we start with the emergency, right? Like a rapid disaster, a levee stabilization, an emergency embankment. We've done those from South Dakota all the way down to Missouri. We have worked on structural dams, and we've also worked on earthen levee dams up in Big Bend, South Dakota. That was a really interesting one. And then as we kind of work down, as floodwaters come down, even though, like Deron and Rob both said, most of the work happens when they don't see it, or the cleanup also happens. So the next phase that we would move into typically are projects where we had damaged infrastructure components like wastewater treatment plants, lift stations in the state parks. In Ottawa, Iowa, the water treatment plant in their campground right off the river was just destroyed during the flood of 2011. So we come back, we start rebuilding those sort of components. And then the part that I really like is when we get into more of the community focused projects. Lake Manawa throughout the 2011 and 2019 floods, it's right on the Missouri River. And what happens with floods is you bring all of the sediment and everything down the river with you, and it's got to go somewhere. Unfortunately, Lake Manawa took a big hit in our flooding. And so we had the opportunity to work with the Iowa DNR on a dredging project with the large dredging contractor in 2015 and again after 2019. And that, again, creates that community space. People wanted to get their boats in there. They wanted to fish in there. Something that I'm recently really happy to see is now that we're 5 years post flood disaster, almost 6 years from Council Bluffs, is I recently attended a workshop. It was hosted by a former U.S. Army Corps of Engineers construction rep, but they're looking at sustainable trail building along the river system instead of like, we used to just see concrete trails everywhere. And now they are looking at where it's really important is what we call the wet side of the levee, because even though, like Rob and Deron alluded to, people want to interact with the river, just because we're on the wet side of the levee, which is the closest to the river, doesn't necessarily mean that we can't enjoy amenities there, but they have to be amenities that are truly resilient, meaning that if it floods again, and it will, right? It's Mother Nature. These amenities can kind of withstand that. They're resilient in structure themselves. So part of this resilient trail building is utilizing natural landscape, understanding the volume and velocity of the water when it does come, shedding that off quickly so that the trails can be restored with minor improvements back to keep them in shape. One of the things that I think is really important when we talk about resiliency is Deron had a great point on these eye walls, these big concrete ugly structures that the Corps of Engineers and local municipalities and states built everywhere. They're ugly and they're eyesores, and it's really it takes away that community focus of your waterways or your lakes. So anytime where we can incorporate green infrastructure and make it look like a natural park, and it is a park. It can be a dual use zone. It can be protective and it can also be an amenity. We're seeing a lot more of that. One thing that's been exciting in the last 20 years is there's been more focus on making sure that all of those areas are ADA accessible. So you're seeing these big, long, meandering trails up the side of the dry side of the levee, which would be the community side of the levee that it's protecting. We used to not have access up to the top of these levees where the trails went down for if you were in a wheelchair, if you had any sort of physical limitation, you really couldn't enjoy that amenity. And now there's more focus on making sure the entire community can enjoy those spaces. Dubuque, I know, has done a fantastic job. So is Cedar Rapids. Council Bluffs, we're getting there. People are starting to talk more about this. I've been in other parts of the country where they've just done a fantastic job. People don't even realize that what they're standing on, the concert they're enjoying, the overlook that they're standing on, they don't even realize that that is an actual protective structure. And that's kind of the idea, right? One of the things that in disaster recovery, we started talking about really a lot in the last 10 years is native plantings, infrastructures. Where did the water of the Missouri River used to go? What grew there? What types of plants, came right back after a flood? What root systems went down? Especially when we get into the Loess Hills over here in western Iowa, when we start talking about volume and velocity of water coming off of those hills, when we strip those hills, the soil comes right with it. If we get a heavy rain, that silts in, what should be a natural watershed should floodwaters come up. So making sure that our hillsides have these native plantings, prairie grasses. I don't know if you've ever seen a cut section of a native prairie, but the root systems are just phenomenal, and it helps stabilize soil. So a lot of things that I've been a part of, anywhere from the very hardcore protective structures of disaster recovery, a physical building of a levee or a sluice gate, a structure that protects all the way down towards more of the green infrastructure and fun stuff. We were able to restore softball fields that got flooded out, So putting back those community amenities, the faster we can get that back for community post-disaster, it just helps everyone kind of come back together. It's really hard on a community after a natural disaster if it still looks like a really bad disaster and they don't have those community amenities back.
Are they building those community amenities in the same place again? Or are they building them, or are they looking at building them in a different way to be more resilient? Like, if you understand.
Definitely, there's definitely a push to build them in a way that is more conducive with future increased weather events. Some things that we know that were built 25, 35, 50, 60 years ago, they're not easily replaced after a major, flood event. They're costly, and people don't like that. If we can incorporate like the natural amphitheater, the water comes up into that when it recedes. You've got some seating, maybe some minor dirt work, versus imagine if we build structures and buildings there out of wood and insulation, we're tearing all that apart. So yes, there is more of a focus to build in a more resilient manner with resilient building materials, or even the types of things we build there.
Yeah, and I should have said, meant to ask you like how, and you addressed this a little bit, so maybe I'm just asking you to repeat yourself, but over the last 10 to 20 years, how you've seen that planning change, like from, like you said, you went to the conference and heard about the trails that are on the wet side of the levee. Like, are there other things that you're seeing that are different, like that maybe you're being asked to build that are different than you would have been asked to build 10 or 15 or more years ago?
I would say more than 15 years ago, we were much more concrete structure, barricade type structure. Maybe this is a positive that came out of, 2 500-year flood events that happened within a short period of time, is when you get hit hard, really hard within a decade, you have to take a hard look at your community. So yes, since 2011, 2019 floods, we have seen a much greater emphasis put on sustainable, resilient amenities and infrastructure along those systems. Mostly what I think has driven it is the community, it's taxpayer dollars, right? And if we continue to rebuild in the same manner and the taxpayer dollars aren't spent in a way that they think is fiscally responsible, it's a problem. So that's a good thing that's came out of this. People are demanding better design principles.
Mm-hmm. Olivia, I don't want to forget about you, but I do. Some of your projects are some of the spaces you work in are so unique. So, but I want to get to you. We're talking about planning, and I wonder if you could talk about your role at the DOT and how that intersects with what we've been discussing, because like you said, you're looking at resiliency and planning of transportation systems, and I may be butchering that a bit, but how is the DOT working in this space? How is it planning in this space?
Yeah, that's a good summary, Sara, actually. So the DOT's goal for making the transportation system more resilient is really measured by our ability to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions. But then on the flip side of that, it's also to withstand, respond to, and quickly recover from those disruptions. So kind of a long definition of resiliency. So we kind of like to bundle it up into something called the 4 R's, which is how we really measure our resiliency at the DOT. So the first R, robustness, is just our ability to withstand and absorb the shocks. And then redundancy is having backup systems that we can put into place when those disasters do strike. And then responsiveness is our ability to quickly recover, and resourcefulness is having those resources available that we can just plug into. So we definitely have a very structured sense of resiliency from the planning side of things. But throughout the whole DOT, I think resiliency is definitely on the forefront of people's minds. And so my role is to mesh all of the resiliency projects that are going on across the state and the discussions that are happening across the state, as we've heard from some of the other panelists about what those discussions look like, and help to implement them and formalize them into our long-range plans. And this is important because by gathering all of the resiliency projects that are happening across the state, we're then able to look at, from a system level, well, what are the gaps, or what are the things that people are focusing on? Is it flooding? Is it winter storms? Is it, a mixture of these things? Are there other things that we need to look at that we haven't looked at before? And so we're able to do that on the systems level by combining all of these projects that are going on. We actually have something called a resilience improvement plan. And so everything I mentioned previously is really formalized and put together quite nicely in that plan that guides our state DOT vision for resiliency.
Is resiliency a part of every project that's planned at the DOT? Is that something that you're looking at every time you undertake a project?
Yeah, so I think that it is a goal in every situation and every project. I mean, as we've discussed here just in the past 40 minutes, resiliency is truly a win-win situation, pretty much any way that you spin it, whether you're looking socially or economically. So I think that people at the DOT recognize that. Our leadership, we're really lucky at the DOT, also recognizes that. And it's at the forefront of our business plan too. So we have that backing for resiliency and having it within all of our projects. I think by having this top-down approach and really such buy-in from leadership on the topic of resiliency, it makes it very apparent in the work that we do because of that.
Are there specific projects? Because I mean, you don't automatically think of the DOT when you think about infrastructure and building resiliency, but are there specific projects that you can point to that ways that the DOT has made the transportation system in Iowa more resilient?
Yeah, so there's so many different engineering resiliency projects that are occurring across the state, particularly on the transportation system. I'm not an engineer, so I'm probably not the best or most qualified person to talk about the granular details of those engineering projects. However, I can talk about some of the more planning resiliency related analyses that we've done that have a direct impact on our transportation system. So for example, the statewide flood resiliency analysis, it's up on our website. Anyone can look at it. And this is a data-driven method that identifies and then assigns a score to specific sections of our transportation system in Iowa that are most vulnerable to a 100-year flood event. So by having this statewide analysis, Iowa's decision makers, district planners, district engineers can use this as a strong backing to get things like funding or just more eyes or support on their projects. Because if they're doing a project that is on one of these routes that we've already identified as being more vulnerable to flooding, they then have this like data-driven resource available to show their constituents or whoever they're needing backing for this project. They can show that, yeah, it is a data-backed project that we believe will have a really big impact. It was created back in 2021, so it's going to be due for an update that I'll actually be doing here, hopefully sometime early next year. And it has the 4 R's of resiliency, like I had mentioned earlier, baked into that in the different variables that we look at for that analysis. So it's been a cool analysis to be a part of, and it's a way that we look at resiliency from a planning perspective, but it does have real world applications that are then applied to our transportation system.
Okay. And we've talked a lot about flooding, but Olivia, I think you mentioned winter weather. Are there other disasters? Like, I don't want to forget the other disasters. I'm thinking, I think you said winter weather when you were talking about it. But how is the DOT preparing, or how is it really resilient when it comes to winter weather?
Yeah, so in general, like you said, Sara, there are other hazards that we have to look at in Iowa. In the Resilience Improvement Plan, we actually identify 9 different hazards that are particularly related to Iowa. And we do something called a risk analysis to find the hazards that are of highest likelihood and highest consequence. So, I mean, it's no surprise that flooding was our number one issue. However, to your point, there are also other natural hazards. So, as a good example for a recent analysis that we did relating to winter weather is we're trying to mirror the statewide flood resiliency analysis. So looking at a statewide screen of our transportation system, but developing it specifically for blowing and drifting snow. So, I mean, we're all from Iowa or live here now, you know, in the winter time when there are some roads out there that are completely impassable, like you can't get there, partially due to the blowing and drifting snow effect, or even if the road's not completely covered. I can tell you from experience, I hate driving in the snow. And then when it's also blowing and drifting, it's just not a very safe experience. So we recognize that this is a problem across the state. So we're in the beginning stages of trying to develop an analysis, again, similar to the statewide flood resiliency analysis, that shows which part of our highway systems and interstates are more vulnerable to this natural hazard, and then hopefully projects will become able to be backed by this analysis in the future, like the statewide flood resiliency analysis had.
Okay. Tamara, I want to bring you in because I know from our pre-meeting that you've been involved with some Iowa State University research into 3D printed homes. Can you tell us a little bit about what that research is looking at and how those homes might be resilient?
Sure. We were working with Iowa State University on 3D printed research. The focus when it started was for home construction, and there was not a home built by Iowa State University, but some of the, what I would call better things that came out of that research was an additional grant from FEMA to study the materials that we could use for 3D printing for 3D printed storm shelters. Kind of going back to what you talked about, additional weather events. So the idea behind the 3D printing in homes and or the shelters is it is a very resilient structure, concrete, right? Flooding, 3D house really isn't going to help you if it floods, other than reconstruction, little less if you leave the interior walls without drywall and whatnot. So maybe less costly. Where it really comes in and shines when we utilize 3D printing construction is fortification, safety, which was a big win. Some of the things that we found, we did a lot of thermal break testing to compare wall sections between a standard 2x4, what you would call a building code wall for a home versus a 3D printed wall. We did many sections of that. And some of the things that we found through there that kind of tie back to what you call extreme weather events, it's heat and cold, right? Because thermal loss goes both ways. It can come from extreme heat or extreme cold. So some of the things that we really identified were if we increase exterior, continuous exterior insulation, that really increased our R value in structures, wood framed and or 3D printed structures. We also found that there is one of the things that we really need to have is a backup energy source, whether that comes from solar or generators during these extreme weather events. The future of the 3D printed homes, it is a constantly evolving technology. I've had the pleasure of working with Erector Bots out of Anza, California, with their technology. They build the printers. They're also working on recycled materials instead of concrete to get a more environmental friendly material, if you will. Also been working and speaking with Allquist 3D. They've done some interesting projects out in California, also in Tennessee, utilizing different technology. There are a lot of uses where I see that being a big win. If you know anything about the government, what we call like a life safety building, think of a fire station, police station, storm shelter, 911 center. They're always built with concrete, right? Typically, they have to withstand, you want those buildings, no matter what, to withstand a terrible weather event. 3D printing has that advantage where we can add additional fortification, rebar, tying back in those structures to create those. The printing technology in Iowa is still evolving. People do not realize, but Iowa, with its heat, cold, warmth, humidity, I mean, you name it, we have it here, right? We are one of the most difficult climates in the world to build in. Most people don't think of that. They think of the North Pole or, like, oh, the extreme heat of somewhere. That's terrible. But when you're talking about a temperature swing that can go 150 degrees, right? So we have to design, and we also have to be able to operate the equipment and build within kind of short windows because of that. So it's a fantastic technology. I'm really looking forward to doing more research in that. Hopefully we can get some sort of prototype built, but ran into some funding challenges, but hopefully we can continue that.
Well, and that addresses, we got a question from someone who's watching about another weather extreme, which is windstorms. And I would think 3D technology might be an option for that. Cedar Rapids just had the 5th anniversary of the derecho, and Rob, you're a flood system manager, but so I don't know how familiar you are with resiliency around the derecho or windstorms, but there's a lot of discussion about how do you build more resilient structures now going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. The 3D printed technology would be fantastic for building structures that are to be able to handle a derecho. Also, one of those things we're looking at, I know the state of Iowa at one point was focusing on fortified technology, which is just, think of heavier anchors for your roofs, thicker wall systems, things that can really withstand. One of the things that people do not think about when they think about extreme weather events is everything around you being able to withstand. So I have a son who is a wildland firefighter, and some of the things that they see in fires, right? Because we are not immune from fires in Iowa either. And when we start talking, what we saw during the derecho was a lot of falling trees that were old that probably should have been taken down. We saw a lot of diseased trees should have been old, taken down, structures that were not sound. So I think we can also look outside of just the structural buildings into the environment that we live in and say, hey, if we have these trees within so many feet of XY buildings, maybe we need to trim. We need to look at kind of how we're placing landscape, wind barriers, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Rob, did you have anything to add about derecho planning?
Well, one of the things that, yes, I've unfortunately gotten involved with that too.
All hands on deck, right?
Yeah, all hands on deck. I've actually been in Washington, D.C. discussing this at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Heat islands, I mean, we talk about heat, but, when the trees come down, you've actually now created some heat island effects. So we're also being very purposeful in, what trees we go back. I think it was great that Tamara mentioned the disease trees. We had way too many ash trees, which we discovered in the derecho that, could be a natural disaster by the emerald ash borer. Trying to make sure all the neighborhoods have, equal cover because the heat island effect, heat is that's a killer. So, that's really important too. But yeah, we've been through, we do also look at drought. I don't know if we talked about drought today. Our water system's got a plan for drought. We've got a huge plan for USDA's grant was, I think, $6 million for for replanting trees because we lost like 800,000 trees here. So what trees you put back are also important too. Some are better than others. I mean, when I moved to the Midwest, I could not believe how windy it is here compared to the East Coast where I grew up. So it's different. You need to have different trees here. One thing I did just want to say as I was thinking about this, though, climate change is sometimes a tough word and it's been politicized here, but a good project is a good project. The city of Cedar Rapids has gotten grants through, both the Democrat administrations, the Republican administrations. We've gotten grants from the Iowa DOT for flood control. You wouldn't think, why are they involved in that? US EDA, FEMA, even the Union Pacific Railroad has participated. When you have a good project, it's a good project regardless, and resiliency still, stands out as what's really important. I think that is really key because there are so many different types of disasters, and the Army Corps does practice a lot more than flooding. And I know we focused on flooding here, but there are a lot more, as we said.
Deron, I wonder if you've also seen the planning and support for these kinds of systems sort of transcend political divides in Dubuque.
Yeah, I could echo everything that Rob just said. We've been successful in partnering with both past administrations over the last 20 years. So, and I think, like Rob was saying, you have a good project for Dubuque. It's really planning the work, have a plan in place. And then if you have that, that's what makes people understand and get on board. Is they see your vision and they can see how what you're trying to do might match up with the mission of, say, the Corps of Engineers or the mission of the, US EPA or Fish and Wildlife or all these other community or potential state or federal funding organizations. And that's one of the things that we did. It's almost like marketing your project, changing the name to match up more to use the words that they are looking for. And so we've described the B Branch flood mitigation project in, many different ways to whoever we're, potentially trying to partner with to show them how what we're trying to do matches up with what they're trying to do.
Well, and I would think that in a sense, you have to sell it a little bit to the community as well, which that goes back to our discussion about making sure that it's not just a wall around the river that protects the city, that the residents, that the local elected officials, that everybody's on board with it. I would think that's also important.
Yeah, and
I would just, can I have one quick comment? The city of Cedar Rapids is raising taxes to pay for part of its local share, and the public is on board with that. When I said it was a good project, but you don't do it without selling.
Yeah. And how often are people on board with their taxes going up?
Exactly.
Well, I had a whole other page of questions that we didn't even get to, which just proves that there is so much to this discussion. But I need to wrap this up because we're almost at time. I want to thank our panelists for participating in this discussion. You brought really valuable insight to this issue, and I hope that you have inspired thought and conversation for the people who watched. I wish I could have gotten all my questions. We had a really great planning session earlier this week that I wish everybody could have seen too. Thank you also to our audience for their attention and participation. And thanks to ITC Midwest, our presenting sponsor for Iowa Ideas. This session has been recorded and it will be available at iowaideas.com. So you can go there if you'd like to watch it again or you missed part of it. But thank you all of you. Thank you to all of you for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for hosting.
Okay, thanks everybody. Bye.